Today we're going to go over adding supports effectively to a surgical guide, which can be used for not only surgical guides, but any STL that is not flat, such as a model, where you would need supports in geometry that is not flat. In this demonstration, we're going to be using the EvoDent E120 printer, and we're going to use PhotoDent surgical guide resin from Drebe. As you can see, it prints at 100 micron layer thickness, and we're going to save these parameters. If at any point during this process you want to choose a different resin, instead of starting over, you can go down to this bar and change it. First thing we're going to do is we're going to open a file. I have saved to the desktop surgical guide. One of the first things you're going to have to determine is where you want your supports. In most surgical guide applications, we're going to be put them on the back side of the surgical guide, because the part that snaps onto the teeth are more critical and you don't want to disturb them with supports. There's a couple ways to rotate the surgical guide or any STL in 180 degrees. You can do this manually. By using the circle rotation and do it manually. This is very effective. If you do not want to use the manual application, you can always go over to your orientation icon on your left-hand side of the screen, and you can rotate around your y-axis 180 degrees. This is also very effective. Once you do that, you can go back up to your automatic layout and let it position your surgical guide to your platform. When it turns from red to blue, you know it's inside the confines of your build platform area. It will put the lowest point at Z0, which is platform 0. If you're happy with this orientation, we're ready to add supports. Over on the right top corner here, we have an icon that allows you to move the platform to a specific plane for viewing. So let's go on to adding our supports. We're going to go to the supports icon on the left toolbar. We're going to open up the advanced parameters so that we see the entire page of parameters for supports. It will come in with default parameters based on the surgical guide resin that you choose. You can use them or you can change them. In this demonstration, I'm going to change them slightly. Our parallel spacing is how far apart our supports will be that meet the rest of the parameters on our page. I'm going to move our parallel spacing from 2 millimeters apart to 4 millimeters apart. The parameters that I give you in this demonstration will work, or you can choose different ones and you can play around with them until you get the distance, size of the supports that work best for your application. So we're going to start with 4mm spacing. We're going to leave our support size at 0.6mm. Our base thickness is the thickness of the base that's going to be attached to our platform that our supports will be attached to. The support point size is what's the size of the support that will actually touch the STL. And then the bottom size is the base size of the support that touches the base thickness. Okay, I'm going to up the base thickness from 1.2mm to 1.5mm. This is just a matter of choice for me. I like my base to be a bit thicker. It seems to be easier to take a thicker base off the platform when it's done printing. There again, you can play around with this number to get the thickness that appeals to you. The baseboard size is the size of the base outside of the geometry of your STL. So on this, it's going to be 1mm thicker than the outermost edge of your STL. This is really not a critical number, in my opinion. I'm going to leave it at 1, but if you wanted it a bit larger, you can move it up, or you can move it. Actually, you cannot move it down. 1 is the smallest number. Height above base is going to be the length of your supports from your lowest point. So if our lowest point is now touching 0, we're going to be 3mm off the platform with our support length. We're going to leave that at 3mm. It's recommended. Then we're going to go to our surface angle. Our surface angle is the angle off the platform. So if we drew us an angle right here on the geometry of 45 degrees, at the point where it touches our geometry at 45 degrees, that's going to be the highest point on our geometry that it will put a support. For this demonstration, we're going to leave it at default because at any point during adding supports that you need extra ones, I will show you how to add or delete supports. So now that we have our parameters in a configuration that we think will work for us, we're going to let it automatically generate the supports. Now, if we were to stop at this point and go ahead and send this to the printer, we're taking a risk of missing an area that may be lower and unsupported. So in my opinion, it is critical that you always check the supports that you've added to your surgical guide. To do this, we're going to go to the bottom view of our platform. For our file browser, if we would like to get it out of the way, let's just click on the X. To bring it back at any point, you can click File Browser in the lower right-hand corner. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our slide bar on the right-hand side of our software. As you can tell, it's telling us that we have 200 layers of this print. In its most down position, we're going to start from there, and we're going to use our forward arrow key on our keyboard. Each click is one layer. We're going to keep clicking until we start seeing our surgical guide appear. You will see a blue area here. This is part of our surgical guide. And as you can notice, it does not have a support attached to it. This would cause us a problem with our print. And this is one of the critical lessons of adding supports to any geometry. If we rotate this around, you will see that that area is unsupported in any way to the platform, which means that when it starts printing, it's basically printing in space. It's just basically floating in the resin and not attached to the platform. It makes it very easy for this, since it is close to your glass resin tank, to attach to the glass, because there's nothing to attach it to the platform. And as it builds, it will build a hole. It will print a hole in your surgical guide, which would cause this to be a failed print. If there's enough areas unsupported in your geometry, it may, in fact, pull the entire print off your supports and attach it to your resin tank. And thus, you will not see anything on your platform except for maybe the base. In either way, that will signify a failed print. So what we need to do as we're processing this is make sure that every unsupported area has a support to it. To do this, we're going to go back to our bottom view. We're now going to use our back arrow to make sure that this is the starting point of our surgical guide. We'll then use our Edit Supports bar. We'll check to see that our parameters are the same as the parameters that we used on the original page. And we can now add supports to this unsupported area. Keep in mind, this is the beginning of your build of your surgical guide. The support here is critical for this to be a successful build. We're going to use our forward arrow key and continue to view our surgical guide. As it gets larger, you will want to add supports. And then we see other areas that are unsupported that are starting to show themselves on our platform. Each and every one of these needs supports to make this a successful build. Do not get in too big of a hurry while doing this step. The amount of supports that you need is not an exact number. If at first you're unsure, my rule of thumb is add a support. To me, it's easier to take off 1 or 2 extra supports than it is to go back and have to reprint a surgical guide that was unsuccessful. Remember, the first part of your build is going to support more of your build as you go along. So a good foundation here will aid in the overall success of your surgical guide print. Please also keep in mind that the size of your supports is a personal preference. If you use smaller supports, you will need more of them. If you're going to use larger support anchors to your part, then you may be able to get away with fewer supports. It's all relative to what your post-processing needs are. You can always use your back arrow key on your keyboard to go back and check any areas to make sure that they are supported. I want to re-emphasize that the time it takes to remove a support from a successful printed surgical guide will always be less than the amount of time it takes to reprint your surgical guide from a failed print. Once we're finished going through the entire part and think that we have a successful amount of supports on our surgical guide, we're going to apply our support edits. After that's completed, it will bring up the entire supported part with the base and supports so that we can, again, visually look at it. And if we feel comfortable with the addition of our supports, we are ready to send it to the printer or to a thumb drive, whichever is your choice. So go down to the Start a Print selection on our left toolbar, name it, in this case, we could locally save it to a thumb drive, or we can send it directly to a printer that is on our network. Thank you for listening.